You are on the next level. This is The Beautiful Truth, where the expression is still free.
20 seconds and counting. 10, 9, ignition sequence start. 6, 5, 4, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour.
And you are very welcome. This is The Beautiful Truth on breakfornews.com with Fintan Dunn reporting, and thanks very much for joining me, folks, as we take a look at what just happened in the United Kingdom 10 days ago. This is Monday the 4th of July, and we're looking back at the last week or so, ever since Great Britain unleashed the Brexit blues, the new rebadged Conservative Party, who are now, it seems, going to fight against some zombie Blairites in Labour. Yes, folks, it's the New World Order's fuck EU last stand. And whatever way they want to paint it, folks, this has been a retreat by the New World Order and a victory of sorts for the rest of us. And you'll hear all about what's been going on. Who did it? Who pulled off Brexit? Why did they do it? How did they do it? When did it nearly derail on them? Where they masked it and hid it from us to make it a surprise? And what's next for the New World Order as it loses control of Europe? That's what this is, folks. An admission of defeat and a realization that no, they won't in the end dominate Europe, and so time to get out. And this was orchestrated by the New World Order, and we'll go into all of that as we take a look at the inside story of a New World Order operation, Brexit. And you know, Brexit is at multiple levels. So at one level, it's a very welcome kick in the nuts for the bureaucrats in the EU and the banksters they represent. At the same time, it also marks the end of the NEO-BLAIR-IST era in the United Kingdom, and it is essentially the crack in the system, the one crack in the system, and from which a cascade of events flow. And fake politics begins to be replaced by real politics. Unfortunately not in the United States, but we'll come back to that. But look, let's focus on the good news. It's the end of fake politics, because essentially you've really had Blairites running the place ever since Tony Blair showed up. And I mean, 17 years worth of Blairism, a bit of Gordon Brown thrown in the middle of all that, but you finally got rid of all that. Let me explain about Blair and Cameron and what we've had to put up with for the last, since 1997, for crying out loud.
It soon became apparent that Cameron was copying everything that had previously worked well for Blair, word for word.
It's a tremendous honour and privilege.
It is a huge privilege and an honour.
Gesture for gesture.
Everyone could see it. It was like single glazing. The way he used to hold his hands in front of his tits like that.
By taking the tough decisions.
Tough, long-term decisions.
Punch and Judy.
The Punch and Judy politics.
You should dig up the archive on Desert Island Discs. Cameron copied all of Tony's choices except for the Foo Fighters track.
Values don't change, but times do.
That is the change that I'm talking about.
We can change public services.
Public services.
Education.
Education.
Specialist schools.
Special schools.
In China and India.
India and China, 8 years. 8 years.
Aspirations.
Aspiration.
And courage.
Courage.
Million. Fringe.
Never.
Change.
Change.
Again. In turn. But times. Time. Change. Change is marching on again.
That's got to change.
Change makers. Changes.
Turn and face the strain.
Changes.
I don't want to be a rich man.
Changes.
Turn and face the strain.
And of course, the more it changes, the more it stays the same, including this little operation. I mean, what's the essential difference between a Conservative party, which is led by Cameron, who's a Blair clone, and who will be replaced by more Blair clones, and a Labour Party, which is populated by rebellious Blair zombies rising from their Blair graves and trying to overthrow Corbyn? I mean, it's Tweedledum and Tweedledee, despite all the Brexit hoopla. There's been some very, very clever games played here, and they're marketing games, folks. And the latest piece of marketing is, this one. Oh no, it's not. It couldn't possibly be Margaret Thatcher light. Oh no. I mean, is that all that you can offer us? Is multiple variations of Tony Blair followed by a return to Margaret Thatcher? That's the new ideology, is it? I see. Okay. So, when you peel away the veneer of current events, you see the gestalt is still the same and hasn't really changed. So let's cut through the marketing and get down to the detail. And part of the reason why people have been, if you like, taken unawares is that this has been deliberately shocking, because shocks throw you off balance and you don't think so straight. So there was a lot of trouble gone to achieve this result electorally, and to make sure that the general chattering classes, liberal chattering classes of England, did not wake up to what was about to happen, and then that when they did, they would be quite shocked. This is the desired effect, folks. But it wasn't entirely a shock to the folks on the Break for News forum, where we've been tracking this, and where we came across information months ago that told us exactly what was going to happen, and that the New World Order were about to pull a Brexit on us all. Thanks to, in part, Big Ern, I think it was, who posted a comment just wondering which way do the NWO want it, in a thread on the Brexit EU referendum. Good question. Which way do they want it? And hopefully we'll be able to answer that question as we move on. But back in April, I responded to Big Ern saying that unfolding events are not about whether the UK is better in or out of the EU. They're about whether the New World Order wants the UK in or out of the EU. See, we had stumbled across information early in April that showed us exactly what was going on, and it came out in an unrelated area. It seemed the Panama Papers. You remember that, perhaps, breaking in the media, some whistleblower or something from inside a financial services company in Panama was helping rich people, hide money away in. You probably remember the Icelandic Prime Minister having to resign, etc., and embarrassment internationally as these details of how the elite are hiding their money away began to come out. And of course we were tracking that story. One of the curious things about that story from early on, and I mean very early on, was that the source which passed on the information wasn't actually a whistleblower, wasn't somebody from inside the system, Mossack Fonseca, that company, or its related companies, it seemed, because according to the company, it wasn't that information from within them was passed on outside, it was that they were hacked into and all their information was stolen. So who has the power and ability to go in and steal information like that, and then process it, and then leak it out to the media? Well, perhaps none other than the NSA itself. There were a lot of very interesting things in that. But one of the things that was most startling about the information in the Panama Papers was that the United States was effectively left entirely out of the picture. And as South Park fan posted out in early April, The US is effectively the biggest tax haven in the world, according to Andrew Penny of Rothschild. He reminded us and said that the Panama Papers psyop will encourage the elite to move their money to the USA and out of dangerous places like Panama, where you might get hacked into. So there are levels and levels to this. But there were red flags about this information because it came through the Ford Foundation and other routes, and you can read all about those red flags and the question marks which were out there from early April about who actually was leaking this information. Looking at the countries which were directly affected, they were mostly enemies of the New World Order. Russia, China, Azerbaijan, Iran, and then tossed in there was a little bit of Icelandic scandal and a United Kingdom one. A United Kingdom one about David Cameron, about how David Cameron's family and himself had been secreting money away offshore. The scandal revolved around a mere 50,000 bucks, right? Trump spends more every day on tips. It's chump change. And yet this was supposed to be a huge scandal. Now, you can check out that thread on breakfornews.com about the Panama Papers. Just Google Break for News Panama Papers. But if indeed the NSA were behind the Panama Papers, and they were, despite the fact that players like Zero Hedge were very late into the game, starting to ask that question, having initially tried to muddy the waters. But if indeed it was the NSA, why the hell were they doing down a British Prime Minister? Why were they putting information in there which was deleterious to the interests of the current serving British Prime Minister? I mean, this is the Anglo-American alliance. They wouldn't be doing that to one of their own guys, would they? Unless, of course, there's a damn good reason why they were undermining Cameron just months ahead of the vital referendum. They wanted out of Europe. They wanted a Brexit victory, and part of the preparation for that was the relentless undermining of David Cameron to prevent people buying into his message, you see? And another part of it was hiding the betting odds. We'll get to that also. But this is what was going on. We knew from back in April that there was something up, that there was only one conclusion you could draw from the fact that they were spreading dirt about Cameron, is that the New World Order, through its intelligence services, NSA, CIA, was actually painting David Cameron negatively to get a Brexit result. And we were onto that back in April. And while we're on the subject of that, I mean, the EU is a CIA operation, as a matter of interest. Just Google it, creation of the EU, CIA, and have a little read there and find out about the CIA-inspired genesis of the EU itself. So this is, CIA, NSA spreading muck about Cameron to pull out of an institution which they themselves created. The whole game plan was that the United Kingdom would be in there in Europe as part of the enforcement and control of Europe by the NWO. And that's over. And we knew back in April that there's only one reason that they were taking Cameron out, was because they know it's over too. They know they're not going to have that victory in Europe. They are not going to be able to dominate the politics of Europe. And so, as these guys plan many years in advance, and they're looking years in advance, and realizing which way the winds are blowing politically, it's time to get out. And we were onto that back then. Now, of course, the British people, blissfully unaware of all this, as the final weeks of the campaign closed in, not realizing that the Brexiteers, both within and without the Conservative Party in UKIP and in Conservative Party, had been deliberately kept alive all these many years by the establishment in the United Kingdom, so that if they ever needed to back out of the EU, they could deploy the Brexiteers, unleash them, give them a referendum, and get the result they were looking for. That's, why you've had the issue of the bent bananas from the EU and the constant negative. I'm not saying the EU is a great institution. I'm saying that EU skepticism and the entire EU skeptic movement was a political tool, which could be, if things didn't work out for the NWO in Europe, could be deployed to get them out of it, as it just has been. Again, the British people blissfully unaware of this, and a number of strategies deployed to keep them blissfully unaware of it all, especially the betting manipulation. Back in April again, we were onto this, that the betting odds were saying, well, it's a sure thing, it's like a 2-to-1 certainty for remaining. And yet at the same time, there was a considerable amount of money going on Leave, and there was a shift in the opinion polls in early April, which showed for the first time that Leave was actually 3% ahead. And yet those betting odds, they never shifted. What was happening? What was happening was that big money behind the scenes was going on Remain to tweak the odds and make it look like actually the bookies reckon there's no way it's going to be anything other than a Remain vote. In the final analysis, the amount of money going on Leave was 2/3 of the bets, and yet there was a almost 7, 8, 10-to-1 discrepancy between the size of bets going on Remain and the size of bets going on Leave. In essence, all the money was going on Leave, and big money was going on Remain to keep the odds looking, hey, safe. And the story was put out, when people eventually come to vote in these kind of referendums, they don't actually, pull the trigger. They stick with the status quo. We've seen that in other situations around the world. Don't worry about it, even if the polls say 50-50. That's not a problem, because when it comes right down to it, it won't be 50-50. A lot of people will just stay safe and stay in the EU. Stick with the status quo. So, no worries. And this is how the great liberal chattering classes of Britain were lulled into a false sense of security by this ongoing narrative about how it's not a problem. But it was a problem. In fact, the truth was the reverse. The truth was this. The truth was that if the polls were saying 50-50, that the Remain side were in deep trouble. Why? Because the ones who come out on the day and vote are what matters, not general opinion in the population. Or people who say they might come out and vote, or they will come out and vote. What matters is people who do come out and vote on the actual day. And the ones with all the motivation to come out, having finally gotten their referendum after all these years, were the Leavers. And all the New World Order needed to do to make sure that they won was to keep, as I say, the liberal chattering classes lulled into a false sense of security and make sure they didn't show up on number to defeat, let's say the odds had indicated there was going to be a serious Leave vote based on the betting odds. People would have picked up on that. There might have been a hue and cry and people might have turned out to defeat that. They didn't want that. So this was an essential part, psychological operations designed to conceal and generate a big surprise when the eventual result emerged. So that was a very effective stratagem, because it kept the voters you didn't want at home, and also it shocked the hell out of a whole lot of them then when they actually woke up and realised what had just happened. And everything was going swimmingly for the New World Order, and a decent and good-sized Brexit majority was on the cards in those final weeks. It was on the cards. You could feel it in the opinion. You could feel the shift. And it looked really good for them, as I say. And then it almost went horribly, horribly wrong. In fact, they thought it had, because this happened. Joe Cox was shot dead, murdered by a nutcase who took the entire thing way too seriously and decided to essentially assassinate a leading Remain campaigner, a very sympathetic victim, and something which had a deep impact on people in the United Kingdom. How could they not go out and and vote to defend what she had died for. When it seemed as if perhaps this person was a bit unhinged and had shouted something about Britain first, it was said, prior to killing her, and everything about his MO indicated that he was a political nutcase, and surely this had to reflect badly on the Leave campaign. And it did. It did. And they lost significant, I would say they lost initially 7%. There was a big swing. As it emerged and solidified that in fact this person was mentally ill, who had killed Joe Cox, there was a shift and they got around about 4% back. It is still down 3%, the 3% lead that they'd had. And in fact, it was only in the last 24 to 36 hours prior to the election that the effect of the Joe Cox murder eased and the normal political dynamics re-established themselves, excuse me, as campaigning resumed. And we got this kickback into the original dynamics, and the Leave reasserted their lead. That was how close it had come because of the Joe Cox issue. And the New World Order thought that they'd blown it. I think everybody thought. And if it hadn't been for that final 36 hours return to the original voting momentum, then it would have been lost. And as it was a very narrow result because of Joe Cox, which as far as my analysis indicates was an entirely unpredictable and accidental consequence of the whipped up emotions and the mental instability of one individual. It almost blew up in their faces. And on the night when the results started to come in on the night, it was Nigel Farage himself who was coming out and admitting that in fact they'd lost early in the morning. And of course the betting odds were still indicating a win, but very early in the morning following the voting, while the votes were still being counted and the early results were starting to come out, Nigel Farage came out and he thought they'd lost it because of the Joe Cox. And he said it's been an extraordinary referendum campaign. The turnout looks to be exceptionally high and looks like Remain will edge it. UKIP and I are going nowhere, and the party will only continue to grow stronger in the future. It's a typical defeat statement. So, I bet the New World Order sweated blood, and I hope they did that night. But in the end, they got the result they were looking for. Within hours, Nigel's sad face had been replaced by Nigel's very, very happy face as it was realised that a narrow victory had been secured. But the shock value was intense on the side of those who had voted to remain, because they never saw this coming. And then that shock value was used to springboard the attack on Corbyn. The shock was manipulated into, hey, we shouldn't be shocked, we should be angry. And it's all Jeremy Corbyn's fault, isn't it? So that was the next narrative to be run on the back of the shock. So this was to try and generate the necessary hysteria, and we were tracking this on the forum. Following that, there wasn't just the liberal chattering classes which were about to be shocked. Following that, the Leave campaigners were about to get a big shock, because suddenly, and of course they didn't realise that all of this had been a plot of the hard inner core of the British elite and the core of the Conservative Party, the 1922 committee and all the rest of that. And they thought that Boris was about to lead them to a glorious future. But that wasn't Boris's job at all. Boris's job was to get them to come out and vote, and to present it in whatever way would indicate that this glorious future awaited them all after the referendum. Boy, were they disabused of that notion pretty quick. because it turned out that Boris started backpedaling, strangely, all of a sudden, once they got the victory, once the New World Order got the result and now had the legal and political authority to exit themselves out of the EU, which no longer suited their geostrategic calculations. Once that was achieved, well, the Leave campaigners were rather disposable, frankly, and had to be quickly disabused of the notion that they were about to take the nation over. And so it was that first hesitant indications that all was not well with the Boris Johnson approach to things, and then the knifing, allegedly, by his campaign manager, following which the campaign manager runs himself for leader. But really all of that now turned into rather a sideshow as the true power is revealed by the 1922 committee. And Theresa May, a steady pair of hands, emerges from the shadows to take over from Cameron, as had been planned all along. And if ever the Brexiteers thought that there was some other outcome on the cards, then they were definitely barking up the wrong tree. Hopefully that will wake them up too and realise that, hey, getting out of the EU is only half the battle. The rest of the battle is going to be fought in the United Kingdom itself, because there's some very interesting political dynamics opening up in the United Kingdom right now. And those dynamics refer to our canny friends up north in Scotland. Aye. You see, there's a bit of a problem with the Scots, as the English have been finding out for many a year. And the problem is this. All of these geostrategic calculations were well in place over the last 2-3 years. This isn't a decision getting out of the EU that was made last week, if you know what I mean, politically. It wasn't made in the last 12 months or so. This is made some years ago. And as a result of that, before exiting, the UK elite, the NWO boys, figured they'd give Scotland its referendum, get that business sorted out now ahead of the Brexit referendum, so that they would lock Scotland into the United Kingdom and make sure they didn't get any sort of uppity notions after an exit from the EU. Get it? Only it turned out that they had bitten off far more than they could possibly chew, and that the Scottish spirit had awoken. And win, lose or draw on that first referendum, it was clear that Scotland was no longer going to be the pushover it used to be. And so, despite the fact that they had narrowly won the independence referendum with Scotland, and Scotland remained in the United Kingdom, such was the deep stirring of nationalist and independent spirit in Scotland that it was a clean sweep for the SNP party in Scotland at the next election. Labour were wiped out in Scotland. Everybody else was wiped out in Scotland. And so now they've got a bit of a problem. You see, they've had to, for geostrategic reasons, get out of the EU, but that opens them up now to this counterattack from the independence forces within the United Kingdom in Scotland. And so that's, as they say, caught between a rock and a hard place. So it looks a very staid situation in many ways on the Conservative side of the political spectrum, with a Thatcher-light person running the Conservative Party in a Blairite manner, no doubt, and UKIP sort of acting as the outliers. But over on the other side of the political spectrum, skipping lightly over the Liberal Democrats, who are currently moribund unless they get a whole load of new former Blairite Labour MPs joining the Liberal Democrats. Could happen. But over in Labour, we have again something else that indicates this crack in the structure, in the power structure. We have in many ways the perfect battle between top down and bottom up. You know, Jeremy Corbyn was unanimously voted in by the membership of the Labour Party, who are of a young profile and who have a communitarian outlook. And yet at the same time, the Parliamentary Party the actual Labour parliamentarians, they vote by 172 to 40 to get rid of him. So, how can that be? Well, answering my own question, how can it be is because Labour was set up by Blair and the Blairites. And so all of these zombie Blair clones who currently populate the Labour Party are used to this hierarchical top-down structure. And yet, facing them is the undeniable fact that bottom up, it's Jeremy Corbyn who has the support from the membership. It's top-down versus bottom-up. And indeed, isn't that the battle which is ongoing right now, as the individual nation, etc., is fighting against that centralised power structure, and the bottom-up is beginning to articulate its needs. So what's going on in the Labour Party goes right to the heart of the new political dynamics. We are actually getting politics here, folks. And the totally fake politics is beginning to be replaced in part by some real stuff. And that doesn't just apply to the United Kingdom. Real politics is taking place in Europe as well, as the increasing success of socialist, in inverted commas, as the hardcore neoliberals would call them, as socialists, begin to take over. And we see a standoff, in fact, between neoliberal and socialist forces in Spain, in Portugal. And we see an increasing Euroscepticism married with this socialist trend. No wonder the New World Order wanted out of Europe. But we may yet see a split in Europe and a schism between a core Europe and then the periphery or the independents. So, it's real politics. Unfortunately, what's happening in the United States, and I have to apologise to listeners in the United States that we haven't been covering issues in the USA to the extent that we have in Europe. But, that's because it's just so staged. We have not had this breakthrough. There's no real politics in the USA ever since Occupy were beaten off the streets. That's the last time we had politics. Now, we'll see. But right now, it's so managed, and we all know that Trump's goal and role is to make sure people vote for Hillary. And, so what else is new? It's unbelievable, the level of control which exists in the United States. And right now, folks, the revolution, the leading edge of it, is taking place in Europe. And the dynamics in the USA are very disappointing right now. But you get that. I mean, there was a time when it was the other way around, and the United States was the one which was in the very dynamic phase. So no worries there. These things have their cycles. But meanwhile, I'm celebrating. I'm definitely celebrating. And I'd like to leave you on an upbeat note. I know this has been a very brief overview, if you like, of it all. There's so much we could go into, especially in terms of what's about to happen and what is happening and the political dynamics of the United States and the UK. And I will do that, and look forward to doing that, perhaps with some people on the forum who are well versed in these issues too. But I'd like to leave you with this survey done by YouGov of Remain and Leave supporters in terms of the kind of people the two groups trust. And it makes you worry about Remain supporters. All joking half aside, the Leave supporters, the kind of people they don't trust big time, are the likes of people from well-known businesses, like Richard Branson or Bob Geldof, academics, people from well-known charities, economists, people from the Bank of England, and people from think tanks. And you have to say that, hey, that's right on. Unfortunately, the credulous Remain supporters, well, they trust those people implicitly. Oh dear. Both groups load well-known sports people and actors and entertainers, but again, with the UN and IMF, the Leave supporters can't stand them, whereas the Remain supporters think the UN and the IMF are wonderful institutions. Oh dear. both groups don't particularly buy into senior religious figures or newspaper journalists. But when it comes to politicians from Britain, the Leave supporters in the United Kingdom have a poor opinion of their politicians, much poorer than the Remain supporters do. The Remain supporters think that the really good politicians are all abroad, whereas the Leave supporters think that the politicians abroad are even worse than their own. You know, it's when you see that and realise that the most distrusted by those who wanted to leave are institutions like the UN, the IMF, the Bank of England, academics, think tanks and economists. It makes you think that, hey, maybe the old political divisions don't apply in the way that they used to. Because, you know, there's a lot we could have in common in a discussion between some of the Remain supporters and Leave supporters about these institutions when you get right down to it. And some of the most progressive forces on the left would entirely agree about many of those institutions. And perhaps it is in that direction of a union of both radical left and radical right, a seemingly impossible union, that we will see future political developments. Well, we'll cover all that in due course, I hope. Okay, that's it for another edition of The Beautiful Truth. I will be back soon with more, and I do hope that you can join me for that. But in the meantime, for breakfornews.com, this has been Fintan Dunn reporting.
Will you always keep me warm? Hold me safe and away from harm. Keep day from night, and as the day fades, burn a candle right for me. Will you always keep me warm? Hold me safe and away from harm. Keep day from night, and as the day fades, burn a candle right for me. Walking into the sun, walking into the sun.